So first off, good morning. Welcome everyone to our live event on best practices for world-class culture. I'm your co-host, I'm Antonio Scatina. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Phase 3 Search. I'm joined here today by our founder and CEO, Alex Cooke, who's our co-host and moderator for today's discussion. And we really have the pleasure of bringing together 4 of the brightest and most successful culture leaders in our industry today. And we're here to tackle the discussion around building world-class culture. So during today's event, our experts are going to discuss the blockers to creating world-class culture and then share how they also had overcame these to deliver world-class culture in their organizations. Today's discussion, it's one of several topics we're going to explore as part of Phase 3's Biotech Leadership Circle. So this is something that Alex and I had co-created, the Biotech Leadership Circle, to explore challenging topics that are part of today's ever-evolving world and especially the impact that it has on our industry. And at Phase 3, we really do believe in the importance of leadership. And as part of that, we view our role as that of a facilitator. And just in the work that we do, we are privileged to be networked with our industry's best and brightest leaders, and also to work with these organizations on the front lines to help them build executive teams to accelerate patient access to life-saving medicines. So the Biotech Leadership Circle, this is one of the ways that we believe is going to be most impactful for us to achieve this mission. And our goal here is that we hope to benefit the executive teams and those that are in positions of leadership within human resources, talent recruitment, technical operations, CMC, and quality. So we really wanted to take this minute and thank you. Thank you for being here, taking time out of your day, your morning or afternoon to be with us on this mission as we try to bolster our industry and work toward a brighter future for everybody. So before we jump right into today's event, we have a few housekeeping items that we're going to go over. First, that the event is being recorded live, and after the event, the recording and a consolidated transcription is going to be available for attendees a few days after the end of the event. And in addition, we invite you to put your questions into the comments section of this platform here, and be sure to upvote any questions that you see that you would also like answered. If we run out of time, this is going to be a very tight discussion as well. We plan to send attendees answers to the most upvoted questions that come from the comment section. So be sure to enter them there and upvote them as part of this. And we will say this, culture is a big topic, lots of important parts of culture. We expect that there's going to be a lot of critical questions and other topics that are raised as part of today's discussion. So therefore, what we plan to do is compile these questions and topics for future live events, and then we're going to give them the time that they deserve and discuss them in their entirety. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our co-host, Alex Cooke, just to get us started.
Thank you very much, Antonio. First of all, it's lovely to see everyone. And thank you all of our panelists for joining us, and obviously all of our audience members. Now, some of you may know who I am. As Antonio said, my name is Alex Cooke. I'm the CEO and founder of Phase 3. And many of you will have known me as a CMC and quality executive headhunter that has been around for a while these days. Some of you will know me as a career coach, and by the end of this session, I hope that everybody knows me and my team as passionate advocates for knowledge sharing. My connection with the biotech industry is personal, and I think some of you know my story, which is that in 1995, aged 11, my family and I experienced the heart-wrenching loss of losing my brother, a son. And on that day, I didn't realize that my life was going to be transformed forever. What almost of you don't know is that my route to being a C-suite advisor in the biotech industry has not been a straight line. I actually have built my entire practice on the knowledge of others, and that knowledge that has been shared with me by other leaders. The first 14 years of my career, I taught children under the age of 18, and I traveled the world as a band leader on a cruise ship. I am a guy with a music degree, and yet here I am these days advising biotech C-suites on talent strategy and really knitting together big picture ideas and helping them go after specifics when it comes to how to drive their companies forward. These days, Phase 3 is a multi-million-dollar company. We have a team of 7. We've advanced over 80 assets to market. We've helped thousands of patients. And what I know is that I couldn't do this without the knowledge sharing that has happened from executive leaders. So the question that I came up with was, if a guy with a music degree can become a C-suite leader, how much impact can you guys have if we give you access to some of that information? And that's where the Biotech Leadership Circle came from. It's intended as a series where we get world-leading executives together to give proven, actionable methods, intel, and ideas to help you deliver for the patients that your company support. So today's topic is all about world-class culture, and we've done a lot of homework as to how do we define it, and then also what gets in the way when we're trying to make it. And so with the help of Beck, Brad, KG, and Debra, we're going to try and cover some of these things. Now, I do want to say that we have to put some guide rails in this because culture is such an enormous subject. We could spend a month talking just about hiring or just about DEI and B, but that's going to happen later. Today, we want to deal with some of the wider concepts, some of the bigger concepts, and we're going to take you through the journey that all of us have been on in order to get to this point. So you'll see there's a little slide deck. If it's small, please expand it. There is some useful content on it. I promise it's not death by PowerPoint. So we're going to start by addressing what pillars is world-class culture built on, and then what is the purpose of these pillars. So what we found is that there are 4 pillars that we really identified, and they largely break down as mission, authenticity, definition, and articulation of purpose, which put another way, the talk. Then we then have ownership, congruent action, the walk, and then we have amplification and reward, which is really either the supply line or the journey that you're going on. So how do you make it sustainable? So those are our 4 areas that we're going to get into today. If I can have the next slide, Antonio, that would be great. Great. So, and the next one? Excellent. So in terms of talking about what these things are, each one has blockers, and each of these become preventative to actually getting these things in place. So where I want to start is I just want to start with everybody talking about what is this key subject that we're talking about and how does it impact culture. So just a little more on the definitions before we hit the blockers. So company mission and purpose. So to our panelists, let's talk about company mission and purpose. Let's talk about how it impacts culture, how it impacts our businesses, and we can go from there. Who wants to kick us off? KG?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. And I appreciate being invited here. You know, mission is different, and I think we maybe want to set the stage with folks on the line that a company that's got 2,500 people, it's been around for 10 years, that mission to change that may be something that is turning the Titanic moment. For others on the call that are small startup biotech, this is a little bit easier, a little bit more nimble. So I think for me, historically, in several companies that I've joined, mission is less about the moniker that's on the website. We deliver pharmaceuticals, blah, blah, blah. But it's more about what is our burning platform? What are we trying to do? What is our strategic direction? You know, where is our guide facing us? And I think that is where I would invite folks to start when we think about mission and purpose, is really kind of ground yourself in what is the road that we're trying to take. Maybe others have a different definition, but I'll maybe start us with that.
No, I
Yeah,
think
I would
that's,
just,
that's
oh, sorry, go ahead.
accurate. Go ahead, Becky. No, go ahead. You go first.
No, I was going to say, I agree with what you're saying, KG, especially in terms of a mission being related directly to the company purpose, right? Because a huge part of your culture is having people rallied around what you're doing and making a difference in the world. And I think especially in the biotech space, we're really fortunate that most of the biotechs out there have really a strong purpose where you are giving back. So it's really fulfilling as an employee to know that you're contributing in that way. I think sometimes in culture where it can become a problem is if the purpose isn't clearly articulated, if everybody doesn't understand the mission, the purpose of the company, that's when you start getting kind of a muddy, murky culture.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would add that it's also about, how you connect to it. So having it in front of employees on a regular basis. And, I don't mean to jump ahead, but, it's not just, as KG said, the moniker on the wall. It has to be evident in who we are as an organization, and every organization's journey is very different, as KG pointed out. Your size, your scope, your breadth, the maturity of your business, how long you've been in business, et cetera. All those things influence not only your mission, but who you are and sort of how culture is experienced by employees. So for me, I felt very passionately about you need to be authentic to yourself, but I don't want to jump ahead. So I don't know, Brad, if you want to add to what we just talked about.
I strongly echo your point, and I think there's the what, there's the definition of what the mission is, there's the how, like how does it come to life and how do people connect to it? And then there's also an ethos or a spirit, right? So many organizations in the industry, and I think genuinely so, say they care about patients. And my question becomes, how does that actually show up? Because there are a lot of things you can do, like, for example, if you're in oncology, it's not a bad thing to do a breast cancer walk or to go to Light the Night. Those are amazing organizations. You absolutely should be supporting them. To me, that's more of a check the box thing, right? And the question is, in addition to some of those things that are standard practices, what are the ways that you're really making that show up in the person's experience, and also bringing the organization's voice into what ultimately do we want to create and own together? And so for me, it's that principle of, we all own the culture, we all own the ways that these things come to be forward. And as we talk about how do you increase ownership, one of the ways you do that is bring people's voice into the conversations, which is, again, easier said than done in terms of how you actually not only bring their voice in, but then show that you actually are listening and show that you can take action and create a true meritocracy in terms of people owning it, not just kind of it being decided on by a couple of people in the more senior leadership elements.
For sure. And that is a beautiful lead-in, Brad, so thank you very much. To our next point, which is really talking about, the talking piece. So, authenticity, definition, articulation, and purpose. Now, each of these ideas was kind of seeded by all of you, and I wasn't really able to bundle them together under a singular word, hence why we've got a multi-statement. But who wants to tackle some of these things? Because it's easy to list these as words, but what does that really mean? What do we see that as?
Well, I can go first because I felt pretty strongly about the authenticity piece. So in my career and my journey as a leader, we've often talked about culture, and I've been across lots of different industries, not just biotech. And for me, hearing people say, well, so-and-so does this, or this company does that, why can't we do this? And I always stepped back to say, but is that us? Is that really true of who we are or who we want to be, right? So culture is also an evolution. It's not a stagnant thing that just sits in one period of time. Well, as the company evolves, so does your culture. Good, bad, and ugly, as we've all seen, but hopefully for the good. So to me, one of the most important things is the first two around, well, they're all connected, but around authenticity and being real to who the organization is as it is today. Define it, be transparent about it, even if it's not perfect, because it's never going to be perfect. But identify what that is today and where you want to go. And does where you want to go make sense with your purpose and your vision and your mission and all the things that we just talked about? Because you can't be another company. You need to be true to who you are and where you are in the journey, as we talked about before. So I'll stop there and one of you can jump in.
I'll happily jump in because similar to you, Deborah, this is something I'm really passionate about. I agree with what you're saying. The only piece that I think is a little bit different in terms of what we're doing at Tessera, it's really around leadership being authentic, because that's where it all starts, right? So if you just think about everything we've been through in the last 3 years, I mean, you can pick your poison here, right? The pandemic, social injustice, new generations coming into the workforce. The days of leaders sitting in an ivory tower, it's done, right? It really takes now leaders being vulnerable, being out in front of the employees, knowing what they're doing, right? Like that's the best way to engage. When employees see the leaders being authentic, it starts to bleed through that whole organization. And that really creates that culture where people feel like they can be themselves and really belong.
I think having words sometimes around what we want this to feel like, you know, everybody says, tell me about your culture. And, you know, the easy answer is to say the culture is evolving, because every person that comes to an organization is going to add and change the culture. But I think for other HR leaders, I always tell folks it's nice to have some definition and some kind of, you know, goal or beacon that the company might not look like that today. Company may be 5 people, the company may be 10,000 people, but when you know what it is for this particular company you want to create, and then you put some definitions around it, you can, as you're moving down your path, if you're coming off of that trail with your definitions, you're able to kind of guide yourselves back through. Also, as you're hiring people, you know, we have people remote in all parts of the country. So if you're California or Connecticut and you know, the spirit of the company is entrepreneurial, empowerment, passion, and fun, we're going to have those in both areas, I think is helpful as, again, a definition for some underpinning. So the entirety of the company pulls together and, you know, things aren't isolated as we're hiring people in remote areas as well.
And I guess, you know, from my perspective, you know, I think a lot about articulation and definition. So if I said to everybody on the phone, what's an expensive dinner for 2? We all know what the word expensive means, but I guarantee you I will end up in a very different restaurant, not just because we all like different cuisines, but because we interpret it differently, right? And so, you know, one of the challenges, like I remember when we got the group together at B to talk about designing our culture, because you can be intentional in kind of the way that you do it. And my personal belief is that bringing everybody into that conversation is the way to go. Because, you know, I've seen a lot of organizations where you have an executive team go off and they pull together the culture and the values and they bring it back. And what you end up getting is a culture of compliance. People will try to do those things because they want to be rewarded and recognized, but you don't really get the level of ownership. And, you know, we'll probably get to that in just a little bit. But I think, you know, who doesn't want to be innovative? Who doesn't want to be collaborative? Who doesn't want to have quality in their organization, right? And what they do? Who doesn't want to have excellence, right? Like, so when you sit down and you look at all of the values that you could espouse, the really hard part about it is to try to get a collective understanding of why do we value something the most relative to something else? Because we have to choose a smaller set of values. Even if we value all of those things to some degree, we have to make a choice about what those are. And that actually ends up being a lot harder conversation than you think it will be. But it's a really important one. And I think it's a really rich discussion. And people start to grapple with it a little bit more. And then they start to kind of come in with this kind of understanding of, oh, we're going to have this fuzzy HR conversation about, you know, kind of people and culture. And they come out of it being like, whoa, you know, I really learned something about my colleagues. They learned, I like to say, the genes or the values that were conserved across their teammates, right? And they learned the ones that were distinct. And we actually had people talk about what those are and what their definitions would be. So it's a really rich and actually harder discussion. We try to not make it like lawyers pulling together a contract, because that just makes me want to shove bamboo shoots at my fingernails. But you know, there is power in being explicit. I'll give that to my legal friends.
So
No,
can I jump in on that,
please,
Alex,
Debra.
before you do? I think it's a good segue to number 3. When Brad just said we're going to have an HR conversation, funny coming from the HR people, right? Culture is not an HR responsibility. It's, you know, often we're there to provide the tools. I say this to our organization all the time. We don't own it ourselves. In fact, we're people that want to experience it too. You know, I am an employee first and foremost, period, full stop. I want to have the same experiences that others do. We help provide the facilitation. Sometimes we have to mediate, but it is not ours to own, as all of us said. The organization owns it. And I 100% agree with Brad, where it needs to be a bottoms up, a tops down, everyone in the middle, kind of a hurricane that happens, but it's not an HR responsibility. And so for those of you on the phone who are not in HR, first, thank your HR people, because we've had it rough the last few years. But also remember that you're part of the definition of this, the articulation, and absolutely walking the walk.
You're absolutely right, Debra, that, you know, the ownership piece is vital. And I think that that also goes with congruent action. Because I think we've all been in organizations where we see a C-suite leadership team and they go, we're this, and then the precedent that they set by the choices they make communicate a very different culture, a very different set of behaviors. And, you know, even the order with which we tackle things, I think, communicates to an organization about the importance that we regard it. So if you're a C-suite team and the first words out of your mouth are always shareholder value, well, it doesn't feel like you're in a company that really feels connected and cares about its patients anymore. And, you know, we see this pushback, and it's not to say shareholder value isn't important. It's just that some things are the result of an action that was taken before. So you could argue that shareholder value is created because you have good culture. But what I don't see very often is great shareholder value, or sorry, great culture being created by great shareholder value. Right? There's a disconnect there. So I think the ordering of that is important too. So congruent actions. Does anyone want to talk about that as well? Or do you want to kind of leave that to blockers? Is there anything we want to add on congruent actions?
Yeah, I mean, all I'll say is that, you know, look, there's a lot of things that we do in the people function. We have to do performance management, actually. I like to call it performance acceleration, because the idea that we're having to manage people versus what we're trying to do. If somebody's performing extremely well, if they're performing right in the middle, if they're performing lower, ultimately we're trying to accelerate the performance. But whether it's performance acceleration, whether it's recognition, whether it's onboarding, you know, a million different areas, DIB, whatever it might be. There's the what you do, no different than when you go home, you have to cook dinner, right? There's the how you do it. You know, you can do it at different levels. You can be a Michelin star chef. You can be a sous chef in a New York City restaurant. You could be at the 99 pub here in the Northeast in Boston. And then there's the ethos or the spirit behind it. And I think for me, you know, what are the ways that your values get integrated into those different activities? They will, whether you consciously design them or not. But, you know, a lot of times we focus on the what and maybe a little bit on the how. You know, the differentiation for me is how authentically do the values show up and how meaningfully do they within those different areas. And then what's the spirit behind it too, right? Is it just something that we're doing to check the box because it's a practice that's out there at a different organization? Or is it something that we really believe? I mean, there's that feeling you get when you go home for Thanksgiving dinner. And it's not just that warm and fuzzy feeling, right? You know, it's the soulfulness, the intent, the authenticity that's there. How does that really kind of come through within the practices that you make? And then what are the ways that you can actually have it show up on a day-to-day basis? Like, that's actually a really challenging thing of when people are in a meeting and the values are happening. How do you recognize that? Almost as simple as somebody orders an Uber. I mean, we live in an HR practice, generally speaking, that is trying to catch up to the digital experience of our personal lives. Like, how can we actually use digital tools and methods to make it easier for people to really call out cultural actions as they're happening in a way that holds them up? Because if we value them, we either value them and showing them up on a daily basis, or we aren't, right? And so it's a interesting thought around how do we try to accelerate ownership or enhance ownership, I should say, through some of those different cultural practices.
I think another piece too, you used the definition earlier, Alex, of if number 2 is the talk, here's the walk, or vice versa. But I think that, this is where the rubber meets the road. These are the hard decisions. We have employees that on paper look really good, but, are just assholes to people. Do we keep them? How does that affect our environment? And those are hard decisions when it's tough to find a biostat person, but this person is, not getting along well, and it's constantly, an issue. How do we take action against that? And I think that is what defines and what employees watch for, and how your culture is defined of, do you really mean it? Are you really willing to take that action and to say we want A, and to put that in practice every single day? Because it's not easy. And that's, it's a bit like being on a diet and saying, no, I will not have that chocolate. I mean, it sounds great on Sunday night and we all have a plan, but then Monday morning when the chocolate comes around, it's a lot harder. So I think the ownership and the action piece really need to be thought through, because, this is where the rubber meets the road. And so trying to slowly move people in a direction of a defined culture, this is where the action happens.
Yeah, I agree with that, Kristin. And touching back on something Brad said earlier too, and hopefully, Alex, I'm not getting into the blockers here, but I think that anytime we're creating a culture, trying to build that culture, and you're seeking input from employees, the biggest mistake any company can make is when you get that input and then you don't take action on it. And it has to be a visible action, right? So people have to see that you're actually changing or listening to them, right? But again, that gets into the blockers a little bit, because if you don't do that, it disrupts your culture.
Yeah, and so what I wanted to add was around this, it is probably one of the hardest parts of this whole puzzle we're talking about today. And probably the area where I've seen the most failure. Your intent is sometimes different than the way we act every day. And it might not be, we're not doing it deliberately, we just don't realize it. And what I mean by that is it's what we've all been talking about, the what and the how. So when you promote leaders who are incredibly technical, as KG were talking about, they are superstars, they have everything on paper, but they leave a trail of dead bodies along the way that generally end up in our offices, let's be real. That's not in step with the culture or the values that you are talking about, that you said you wanted to embody every day. But it's a very clear message to the organization. We continue to tolerate these behaviors. We continue to promote these kinds of people. What we're saying to the organization is, this is okay. You are setting up a culture, a subculture, and tolerating behaviors that might be in direct conflict with what you believe your values are around integrity, respect, these things that we call table stakes. So it's the way we make decisions. And Brad, I loved that term, performance acceleration. It's how we promote people. It's how we reward them. Again, I'm jumping ahead. Sorry, Alex.
That's right. That's where we're going.
It is the actions we take every day, the things we not only tolerate, but we actually promote. We have to stop and ask ourselves, is this in correlation with or in conflict with who we say we are as an organization? And again, this is where I feel a lot of companies fall short until someone calls it out and says, hey, we say we want to be innovative, but we've had to ask 14 different people to sign off on this email. I'm sure we've all experienced that. Or we say we want to be agile, but yet we have to get 18 different people to do X or Y. Again, that's not in direct line with who we're trying to be. So this is the hardest part, and where you need to pay a lot of attention on the day-to-day stuff.
Alex, can I ask a question of my fellow panelists that I'd actually be really interested to hear, which is, where are some of the organizations or places that you've gotten your richest and deepest learning around culture? You know, I'm happy to share some of the ones for me, but I can say they've really shaped, and I was really grateful to get access to a number of them. But I'm curious, you know, Kristin and Becky and Debra, you know, what are some of the either organizations, books, and or other resources that have shaped your thinking around culture and how you approach it?
I think ours, I'll speak specifically for Mirati, you know, the shaping of Mirati's culture has specifically been based around the growth. 2 years ago, we're 150 employees, very family oriented, and all of a sudden we find ourselves just south of 600 remote, different arms of the business being added on. And I think that is redefined our culture. Some people miss, you know, what they would call the good old days, but I think that growth in and of itself has kind of forced us to reshape and reanalyze the current Mirati culture and kind of figure out, now that we're a teenager or, you know, whatever analogy there, now who do we want to be? And so that's almost kind of forced us into reshaping and relooking.
Yeah, so I'll answer it in two ways, Brad. From a personal perspective, where I get a lot of culture input is using CHROs or CPO networks. It's really great, I think, to hear what other companies are doing, because that just, for me, it helps, you know, think about, is that something we should do, or how would that work here? Also, we use Culture Amp, who I think is absolutely excellent. They're a vendor that supplies help to build your culture. They have a lot of tools that we use. And then just, you know, things like using engagement surveys, HBR articles, all that feeds into the knowledge base. But when it comes to culture, the thing that I'm really big about is having that employee experience. And I think you or Debra said this earlier, having that employee voice, no matter what we're doing on the culture front, employees have to input into it. So, you know, just as an example, we're a startup, so we're relatively small still, but we're doing career ladders right now. So rather than having HR drive the career ladders, what we've done is we've done a straw man, and we meet with each level and have the employees build that out. And just getting their input, that in itself creates that culture where employees feel back to ownership and that action is being taken based on what they want.
So for me, Brad, it's similar to what Becky talked about. So a lot of networking, talking with others, because you want real life examples, right? So much of culture feels nebulous. It feels really big and untouchable. So for me, always networking and talking with people. And there's usually snippets here or snippet there. So I'm an avid reader. I love Simon Sinek's work. I love Adam Grant's work. At HBR, I've done a lot of work with them where they've come into a particular organization and have done culture work, much like Culture Amp. I've seen tons of culture mapping exercises. So if anyone wants tidbits on those, I'm happy to share. I have some templates I've used in the past. But for me, I take all of the nuggets that sort of stand out, and I then create what makes sense where I am today, the organization I'm with today. And it's my own personal experiences, because while we're talking about corporate culture, I'm very much influenced by the culture of my upbringing. I'm 100% Portuguese. My parents are immigrant. And so working for global companies, it's not just about the corporate culture. There are subcultures and there's regional cultures. You know, we were joking about the Red Sox earlier, but there are lots of other little things that sort of influence this. So for me, it's just being open to learning and knowing that I don't have all the answers and just taking each of those nuggets, something that resonates with me that day. I'll admit it could be a TikTok. I'm going to put it out there. Could be. Do not tell my teenagers I said that. But it's grasping all of those experiences and figuring out how it plays into what's happening at work in terms of culture. So that's how I would answer. But I'd love to hear how you would answer that question. Great question.
Yeah, no, it was very similar to yours. Like Alex, I'm actually a musician as well, and so I think of it as like a little bit of jazz and improvisation. You can incorporate things from other artists, as Picasso liked to say, good artists borrow, great artists steal. And so, you know, some of the biggest influences for me, honestly, I think tech companies have dramatically outpaced biotech in terms of both their people practices as well as in relation to how they think. Parts of it's just the structure of their organization. Their product development lifecycle is so much faster than ours. It demands a different type of organizational responsiveness. And so I think it's meant they've just been pushed a little farther there. So the Netflix culture deck, which is freely available to anybody, you can go and download that. That was kind of one of the first times that really opened my thinking, not just around culture and cultural definition. They talk a lot in there. Like, who would have thought an organization of like over, you know, a couple thousand people could have a five word expense policy that still to this day is there, act in Netflix best interest, right? And they thankfully didn't have a bunch of lawyers who came in and said, no, we can't have that because someone's going to make a decision to stay at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in San Francisco, and we're going to have the Dr. Phil conversation with them of like, what were you thinking, right? Like, I'd rather have that discussion and have to own it, right, than to mandate rules. We tend to design organizations for the 2% of bad actors versus the 98% of people that are like superly talented, managing complex lives and everything else, right? It's hard, but I'd rather take on that sort of work. So that was interesting. I think HubSpot actually has done a nice job of that too, and building on some of what Netflix has done. Marcus Buckingham was the individual who actually came up with the term of it, performance acceleration. I both love and hate Marcus. I think there's some genius things that he says, and I think there's also some stuff that he's just off on the rails. But 9 Lives About Work is a really cool book, and some of the ADP research that he does is cool. Was the other one that I was going to mention? It'll come back to me. Gartner has been sort of a really cool, they have a great CHRO conference. I'm big believers in some of the best practice research that they do going into different topics for HR leaders. The other book will, you know, sort of wrangle loose in my brain at some point here, but those are some of my influences.
I would add TripAdvisor. TripAdvisor has done a lot around culture. And for those of you that have not read the Netflix culture guide, I would highly recommend it. It's great. There's also a podcast where Reed Hastings was interviewed, as was, I mean, Sheryl Sandberg's work is really great. So Podcaster is another place where you can actually get a lot of really good insight from other leaders. But for those of you that have not read it, I would definitely recommend the Reed Hastings Netflix guide. It's great.
Oh yeah, the other one was The Open Organization. It's a book by the founder of Red Hat, Ken Whitehurst, about creating meritocracy. Which is kind of an interesting type of go slow to go fast. How do you bring everybody in?
This has kind of come up in our conversations as well, is that congruent action is not just our day-to-day action, but also who are we bringing in? And one of those big things that I think I've certainly seen on the executive search side, and I think we've all faced, is what is the impact of only hiring for cultural fit or only hiring for technical fit versus hiring for both? And then the other thing is that throws up another problem, which is how long are you prepared to wait for your unicorn? Because there are business needs and we have to balance them. Now, I know, KG, you kind of brought this up. So I'm going to play you in here, my friends. So feel free to lead us off on this.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things, especially on the hiring side, there's this demand that the business has of we need X by Y to do Z. And, you know, I'll kind of keep double clicking on, if we really are serious about the culture, we don't want everyone to be the same. So I'll just try to signal that, you know, culture fit is maybe a little bit of an outdated term. And if we think about this as more of a culture add of, you know, how is this additional hire or additional department or whatever it is enhancing the business in getting us towards whatever that pillar is. So I think that's something that, you know, is super hard. Any TA person will tell you, you know, trying to hold off the masses while you need, you know, X amount of heads is always difficult to do. But that's one thing that I would invite people to consider. And then again, I do think it's about the future instead of just today, because today may not be the business that you're trying to drive for. So, you know, you've got to think about this as, will this person or this position or this department be here to support this organization long term. So I would think about it maybe a little bit more future and holistic, and again, around that culture add versus just culture fit.
And are people using tools and data generators to do this, or is this all just relatively subjective?
I don't know if there's a tool to define that, since everyone's culture is going to be unique to the organization. There are, certain kind of online tools that you could use, but I've not seen one. So if the panelists have a way to go about this using technology, I think that would be fantastic to share. I've not seen that personally.
Yeah, we don't. Similar to what Kristin is saying, we don't have any like secret sauce here to identify that. But I do just want to pick up on one point, because I love the cultural add perspective, because the evolution of a culture, as we already discussed, is so key. But also, I think that also leads into having diverse skills in terms of, if you're hiring somebody for a project manager role and your portfolio is going to shrink, is that person adaptable to move into other roles in the organization? That's where I think it's really important in the interview process and the talent to decipher out, because that adds to your culture add in many ways, right? Because then people see talent being moved across the organization, they see them giving other opportunities of growth and development.
So I think the other thing which has kind of come up is aspirational culture, wanting to be forward-looking, but can you be too forward-looking? And how can that be detrimental to an organization? So how do we keep it so that the distance ahead of us is the right distance?
So I'll maybe comment quickly to this. I think the key to the aspirational piece is actually communication, because I do think in high growth companies, the idea of growing is super fun, and maybe it may affect your stock price, and all of a sudden there's more people to do the work. But there's a little bit of, the other side of the coin, which is, oh my gosh, we have so many people, it's becoming bureaucratic. And so I think.
Okay, I think we may have lost Kristin. Would somebody else like to just kind of pick this one up with aspirational culture?
I mean, real quickly for me, I think it's just a conversation with individuals to ensure as you're building it together, because ultimately, this isn't something that ideally the leaders are sort of doing, but as you're building it, to have that discussion to say it's healthy for us to try to grow towards something, but we have to be realistic about what that level is. And then, what I will say, and we said this as we were building the culture at BU, is that ultimately, the leadership team in a lot of ways, we're like editors, right? And so everybody else in the company can be Pulitzer Prize winning journalists, and they're pulling together really great stuff. But there's times where, we may have to edit something, right, in terms of a title. And some of that may be around the judgment of what's too aspirational or not, right? And so I think that's an important principle. Really quickly, not to jump back to the hiring piece, the two things I will say that oftentimes help with this is, one, a big believer, and this, Alex, around, what we call phased recruiting, like getting a search going before you actually have something, a hiring plan fully articulated. One of our guilty sins in the people function, my experience has been, is that we are behind the 8 ball and getting searches out the door and having the right amount of resources to execute against them. And so it leads to this pressure around, oh, the business needs this person, the business needs this person. And so a lot of another great book I love, Essentialism. There's a topic on there in buffers. As humans, and actually other business leaders do this even more so than we do, so I feel good about it. We typically don't give ourselves enough time to reasonably deliver on the things that we want to at the quality that we're looking for. And so I think that's something that's important. And I haven't seen a great technology to do this. The closest one is Pymetrics. They use neuroscience-based video games. But you have to have a lot of people in the job. So if you're hiring like 50 software engineers, or if you're hiring a bunch of manufacturing technicians, I think it's a really interesting tool to look at, but it's kind of difficult if you're hiring 100 people and they all have different jobs.
So two things I would add, one around cultural fit. Anyone who's worked with me knows I really despise this terminology, mainly because when a hiring manager or an interviewer uses it, I feel like it's a way just to say They weren't like me. And so I often ask a lot of questions, which is why feedback sessions need to be in person and not in writing. But I'll ask a lot of questions. What does that mean? What does cultural fit look like? When you say that, show me how it manifested itself. What does it look like? How did it come up and show up in the interview? Because oftentimes it doesn't actually mean cultural fit. And I agree with what KG was saying. It needs to be thrown out, because I love the terminology cultural add. That's much more appropriate for where organizations should and are going. In terms of aspirational culture, I talked a little bit about this in our prep session. And for me, you know, being in other organizations, when people would say, well, Google is doing this and Yahoo is doing this and Netflix is doing this, and here we are in a high-tech manufacturing automotive industry, I was saying to myself, we're not in the tech field. So when you say Google is doing this, what does having a foosball table mean, or a ping pong table? Articulate what the thing is and how employees are experiencing it. So, you know, to use an analogy Brad was just using, we're not only editors, oftentimes we have to unpack things, because it's helpful to get whatever the opinion is, for help people articulate what they actually mean when they say we want to be like Google or Yahoo or whatever the company is. It's the how. What does that look like, and how is that experienced here at our company? Oh, you mean you want it to be fun? You want it to attract a different kind of demographic. You want to have breaks. You want it to be innovative. All those things make sense, but it might not equate to a ping pong table or a foos table, just to use that analogy. So I think aspirational is important. You have to evolve and you want somewhere to go. But as Brad said, or maybe KG said, you still need to be realistic. And it's constant, like we've all talked about. You're not just going to say the culture is X and then you put it away and you do it in 5 years. I think someone just asked us a question about that on the chat. It's an evolution. It's something that should always be in front of the organization. You should be talking about it, reassessing it, asking questions. Does it still represent who we are today? It should come up frequently. It should be part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the questions that was asked earlier, is how do you check back in with your culture? Because, you know, there's deviation away from the line that you set out, and because it's evolving, naturally it changes direction. So what is the point where you actually check in on that? And then I think a secondary point that was just brought up was the role of culture with differentiation to your competitors, because you need a vision in order to get people to come and build it. So two slightly different areas, one on how do we check in, and then the other, how do we use forward-looking statement maybe to attract.
So I'm happy to jump in just real briefly, because I only have 4 minutes, so I'll try to be succinct and then hand it over to my colleagues. On the how often do we check in? Again, we have a technology application that literally on a daily basis allows people to record our culture live, meaning that every single behavior that we've defined underneath our values is something that people call out. So we have probably, I don't know, 150 recognitions a day that come out around the behaviors that people are living out. So I can actually tell you how much does innovation, actually it's not one of our values, impactful, be impactful is one of our values. We do value innovation, but it's one of the behaviors that we have underneath be impactful. So I can tell you how often that behavior comes up and where it comes up with an organization. So we have some really powerful analytics to show where it does, but it's mostly about just allowing people to hold up the stuff that really matters real time. We also check in on an annual basis where we have a culture day that's all about people engaging around the culture, both welcoming new voices in so that they have tangible input. What do we like? What do we like to change? And so that it's a real interactive dialogue. And then guess who gets to vote on what we actually do? Every single person in the company, right? And so it's a meritocracy-based system of how we go through it. That's how we do it. It's not to say that it's right. And then the other question around cultural differentiation, again, to me, this is just really around ensuring that you can define it in a way that's meaningful to you and the group, and not doing it as a way to try to create some EV employee value proposition, but it's something that really resonates. And then I think the challenge is, it's not just what the definition is, but how do you bring it to life? And my experience has been that typically smaller biotechs are underinvested in the amount of money that when we get to become commercial stage, everybody's willing to throw dollars at sort of $1 billion drug launch. But when you're early on, getting the leadership team or getting other people to say, hey, we want to do a video of our employees, and not just kind of a quick, somebody captured it on a cell phone, but something that's meaningful, not necessarily a Hollywood production. How do we bring that to life? How do we show candidates prior to their experience what we're really all about, not in some sort of fanciful way, but in a real way? And if you can get in the right organization with the folks that believe in it, and you can make a compelling argument, I think that's really the key. It's the how do you bring it to life versus what's the catchphrase or sort of the marketing slogan, because that isn't authentic.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there is I have antibodies when we talk about culture, and we call it a check-in, because this is something that you should be doing daily. It's not like, hey, let's do, an engagement survey. Great, you do that yearly, but you still have to have things on a daily basis where you are keeping an active pulse on your culture. And there's many ways to do that, right? Coffee chats, whatever. But yeah.
100% accurate. Yep, I agree with that.
And if I may just add to that, I mean, Brad, the idea of basically upvoting shout-outs, I think how do we use technology to basically allow the people and our workforce to show us, what is resonating, right? I mean, because the other thing is, I'm sure if you make an action in the C-suite, you're going to see that trickle through in the analytics, right? So I think this is a wonderful way to kind of capture ideas from the front line, feed it up to C-suite, and then take action, and then actually maybe measure the response of it, maybe indirectly opposed to directly. But I think that's an incredible thing. That kind of leads through, I think, to organizational trust and that side of things. Is there anything else that people do for organizational trust or that they found to work, or are we just kind of going more with the theme of do what you say you're going to do?
It is really around walking the talk and making sure that that's visible. And it, as Becky and Brad and even KG said, it's around the stuff you do every day. It's how you behave as a leader. It's how you recognize. It's how you reward. It's who you promote. It's the kind of behaviors you tolerate, et cetera. It sounds so simple, but yet it's probably the thing most organizations get wrong on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, and I think back to Becky's point too as well, it's also, like any good economist, it's almost like you have to press on a lot of different levers, right? So like we have ELT breakfasts, on a weekly basis with individuals, right? Like what are the different forums that you're giving people to interact and engage, to get information, to provide feedback, and then show that you're acting on it? So, I refer to those as like your cultural practices, both the fun ones as well as the more intimate ones, the leadership-based ones, like they all are there. I think the other thing around trust, a big part of trust is transparency, right? And a lot of times we've withheld information from people because we don't feel like they can handle it. There are realistic scenarios where we're publicly traded and we can't talk to people about things, but I think generally speaking, trying to trust individuals with transparency, that really does build that, but it's harder sometimes to do depending on what the area is or what other leaders within the organization view as transparent. So,
and there's something which I just kind of add in here, which is just going to lead us to the next slide as well, which is this idea of metrics. It's an old adage when people say, what you don't measure doesn't change. But if we think about the metrics and reward, how do we measure things to actually support the right culture? Now, that could be EQ forward leadership. But, the reward is the supporting piece of it. But the metrics, they can be leading or they can be lagging. So has anyone kind of found anything which is helpful in terms of leading metrics, implementing that? Or how do people use them?
So, sorry, do you want to go, Brad?
No, please. I'd love to hear from you.
No metrics per se, but we have taken a step back with our people managers and leaders to create training around being an empathetic leader. Because in the biotech space, a lot of times, people being promoted into leadership or management roles, they're scientific experts, right? So they don't always have the people managing skills. So the only way they're going to get that is if you do it very intentional and you take them through a training and let them practice role play. So we've been doing some of that. We haven't measured it though, not yet.
Yeah, and I would just say, Alex, on the leading indicators, because the lagging indicators around, engagement or retention or productivity, there are a number that, you can measure. Maybe productivity is harder to measure or compare against other companies sometimes, especially in biotech. But you see those outputs on those engagement surveys or those pulse surveys that come through. I like to think about it from the lens of there are 5 needs we have as adults, so kind of reinventing Maslow's hierarchy of needs: connection, variety, growth, contribution, and stability. I can't always control stability in biotech, particularly with all the things that happen, but transparency is one of the ways that I can create stability for you, right? In terms of how I communicate and kind of engage with you. And so I view a lot of times my role as a CPO is, what are the ways that I can help leaders and help the organization, help managers better meet those needs? Because I can't always give people what they want. I can't give them the promotion they want. I can't give them the salary that they want, right? But I can try to do my best at meeting people's needs. And the more that I can actually create connection within the organization, the better off those lagging indicators will actually end up being there, right? And so what are then the practices? What are the things that you do as a way to try to meet those needs? And I think Becky was talking about a great one, which is management fundamentals. We're a big believer at B around not just doing a training for management, but constantly drilling it in there. Again, I come from more an athletic background, and I think there's a lot of merit to practice, right? Kids don't go to Division I basketball and be like, I rebounded for 18 years, Mike Krzyzewski. I'm not going to practice rebounding anymore. Like, I don't give a crap if you're amazing at giving and receiving feedback. We're going to make you better, and you're going to practice it, because the truth is, a lot of times we just don't actually put in the work that's needed to create the outcomes. And the truth is, managing people is really freaking hard. I'm still on my own journey in so many different dimensions right that, right? And so, we all are. And so the idea that we can't invest, the truth is there's a credit card debt that comes. There's a really cool other book that was written called Dying for a Paycheck, that's around like the cost of stress in organizations, that this guy at Stanford like literally put the economics for, like, what does it actually cost, not only your organization, which you're paying in your healthcare costs. Everybody wants to complain about how much benefits cost in the organization. Well, guess what? Part of that's the way that we run our society, right? Like, it's almost like polluting into the atmosphere and not kind of having a carbon tax. There's a stress tax that's been out there, right? And there's a management underinvestment tax that we pay within the organizations. We've just fundamentally, I think, oftentimes struggled to quantify it and make the economic as well as just the purposeful based argument of it's just the right thing to do. And if we do this, ultimately we will see pay dividends on the other side.
The other piece I would add around metrics is, obviously it's really hard to measure culture. But some of the things that Becky and Brad talked about are absolutely the things that we look at as, people leaders, retention, turnover, employee surveys, et cetera. The thing that I also look at is employee relations issues, or what I call ER issues, because they are in fact our ER issues, and the kinds of things that my team is experiencing. That is an indicator of the example we were just using about perhaps we don't have enough EQ. Perhaps we have individuals who were promoted into roles they aren't ready for. And what have we done to support them? Or in this case, maybe we have failed them. The example Becky used is a great one, that you have technical leaders that get promoted and don't often get the tools they need to be successful. So it's also looking at, for me, it's sort of what I call the beat on the street, or the word on the street. What's happening in the organization? What are we hearing from employees? What are the kinds of issues that the HR team is being pulled into? That's an indicator of sort of what's happening, what's working and perhaps what's not working.
No, fantastic. And do we support these things when it comes to reward structures as well? Because obviously we can talk about training, which is our front end. And we did actually have a question about providers, but I think we can follow up with that by providing specifics as well on that. When it comes to the reward of it, I think reward structures are so important because they can often have unintended consequences, things that you didn't think about. So how do people tackle that piece of it and try and encourage the right behavior, dissuade the one that you don't want? Because I think that's critical as well.
So again, this goes back to sort of what we tolerate or reward every day. It goes back to how are you looking at your total reward strategy? When you look at bonuses, when you, Brad's technology around those shout outs is great, but not everyone has that kind of technology at their fingertips. So how do you encourage recognition and reward, even from a peer-to-peer perspective? So it's trying to come up with those measurements, those tools, if you will, that enable the kinds of behaviors that are important in your culture, in your specific organization. But in terms of rewards, it all goes back to the way that we operate every day. And for me, it's very obvious in the kinds of behaviors we tolerate from leaders or employees. We used to, in a previous company that shall remain nameless in case someone's on the call, we used to call it command and control. And there was a particular leader that was nicknamed the sniper, because you were lucky if you walked out of a meeting not sweating and feeling like you had your knees taken out from under you. And that, that's horrible, but that's an everyday behavior that we experienced as employees, even as the HR person. So, it's what you tolerate and allow to happen around you, even in meetings. And I don't think people do enough to make that obvious in terms of, this is our culture. We just came out of this meeting and everyone was collaborative and helpful, but this one person hijacked the meeting and turned it into whatever their platform was around whatever they needed to debate that day. And how did we handle it in the moment? How did we handle it after the moment? It's all those kind of day-to-day behaviors that illustrate how we enable these things, reward them, or even tolerate them.
I would just link that back to someone had asked earlier about differentiation. And what Debra is saying there, I think that's the best way you can differentiate your culture, is rewarding the how equally to the what. Otherwise, you're like everyone else out there, right? So you really want to differentiate the way you're bringing those behaviors to life. That's the biggest differentiator for me, at least when I think about culture.
Yeah, I mean, I do think really awesome points, Debra, around, what do you tolerate, right, within an organization? And it's really hard sometimes, because you're trying, and depending on where the managerial or leadership or personal issue or individual contributor issue is, like, how strong is that? And what's the right way to both support the individual as well as to move forward? But then there are places where those lines are crossed, and how quickly do you move to sort of make the change? Incentives are a really, really interesting topic, especially as a neuroscientist. I find these fascinating because it's actually really hard to design a system well. We tend to think about rewards in a very individual-based way versus a team-based way, which for me, I think is more impactful. There's also been this really large shift, which I think we've talked a little bit on this call, from effectively algorithmic organizations of the 19th or the 20th century into heuristic or creative organizations of the 21st century. And we've only been living and managing in heuristic organizations for like the last 20 or 30 years. And yet a lot of our organizational practices, like, I have given you a straight amount of PTO, not just your vacation, but your sick time. Like, somebody gets COVID and then they only get 13 days of vacation because they had to take 7 days off. Like, that is just bonkers, man. Whether you want to actually do unlimited PTO or whether you want to do something else, like, that's a policy that was built off of when we used to have manufacturing plants. Like, that's where that came from. And the fact that we had to make sure that everybody had a strict number of days, only a certain amount of sick time, and it was equitable and fair. The same thing goes for rewards. Like, does it actually produce better performance if I pay you more in your bonus in a heuristic organization? That's a really interesting question. It does for sales, so I wouldn't necessarily, that's an algorithmic job. You're going to do a certain number of things. I'm going to pay you Y. If you do a little bit more, I will pay you Y plus 1 or Z or whatever sort of algebraic sort of nomenclature you want to put onto it. But the reality is that, like, there's some really interesting data to suggest in heuristic companies trying to pay people more in their bonus for better performance actually leads to worse performance, right? And so what I really want to do that for you, right? Like, so at any rate, the point is it's really hard to design systems around reward. The things I can say is thinking about the individual versus the team, thinking about the what versus the how how does that show up in a meaningful way in your, not only just your year-end reviews of like, how did you live out the values? Like if that's just a question someone has to answer versus it really impacts either their bonus, or that you have rewards specifically set up that are weighted around living out those values, both in good ways. Like, do we reward failure, right? You know, good, smart failure is a really great thing, especially in a business that's trying to go after something as hard as developing a drug. How do you reward and stand that up? And are those things that people can, you know, back to ownership, how do you customize reward? Because people may not necessarily just want to hear a reward in front of the whole company, but they also may just not want a financial reward. So there are things like Blueboard is a really cool experiential rewards platform that allows people to pick their own rewards. So they can go like do a cooking class with a Michelin star chef. They can do kind of a wine trip, depending on what the level it is. It allows them to take an experiential reward versus just a monetary one. It's no different than asking somebody to customize the color of their car and do all the other different things. It makes it personal. It increases the level of ownership. It increases the level of meaning. So I think there's both the, how do you think about what the rewards are, and then how do you think of actually executing those in a way that enable people to have choice, to have ownership as a part of what those rewards are.
And that's a really good point, Brad, because we actually haven't talked about customization or individual experiences. And it's really important that, you know, I can't believe we haven't said this yet. It's not a one size fits all, right? I think that's pretty obvious in what we've been trying to articulate. But when it comes to reward and experiences, it is incredibly unique and individualistic. And how I experience our culture is going to be different than how Becky does or how you do, Brad. But reward is 100%, you know, individualistic, meaning what I want for reward and recognition is probably going to be different than what you might want. And so you need to balance all of that in all of these discussions around how you measure it, how you support it, how you enable it. It's different for different people. I'm not saying it needs to be customized to the like absolute infinite number of employees that you have. That would be ludicrous. You wouldn't be able to do that. But you have to remember that it's certainly not a one size fits all approach. And especially when it comes to reward. Go ahead, Alex. You looked like you were leaning in to say something.
I was, and I think what I would lead with is optionality. So you think about how we design strategy for drug development, right? If we know that a drug is not going to be a straight line when it comes to development, so therefore we design different scenarios. So actually having optionality across our reward structures, it makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, it's fascinating to see. You know, it's these ideas. These are the new ideas that we haven't seen before. Even within, you know, phase 3, I mean, we were a sales organization. That's what I grew up in, right? When the team came to me and said, hey, can we get rid of our commission scheme? I was a little taken aback, and I thought about it, and I thought, yes, because the risk is the same to us as a business. It allows you to drive an accountability structure, which is a little bit different, but it had an unintended consequence, and that was that it removed all territorialism. So there was no more land grabbing, because somebody wasn't saying, this is my patch, it's associated with this pot of commission. So by going to group bonus structures across a delivery team, all of a sudden, we now have seamless integration with people slotting in and out of projects. If somebody's struggling, they're not afraid to lean over and pick up that weight and help them through it. And when you look at, you know, the biotech industry and the number of groups that work together, CMC teams, I mean, that's a cross-functional reward structure. What would that do for us? You know, it's ideas like this which I think are fascinating. And Brad, I am definitely going to get the name of your rewards platform. So thank you for that. Are there any other kind of unintended consequences which people have seen, either, you know, as a benefit or a negative, maybe? And this will, I'm sorry guys, we are over time, so this will need to be probably our last question as well.
You know, the one thing I would just say is when we think about the nature of rewards, it's also what are we doing for the reward, right? And a lot of times we tend to think about that in a monetary, or we were even just talking a little bit in an experiential piece. One of the cool books, I'm a big geek around behavioral economics, and there's a great guy down at Duke named Dan Ariely. He wrote a book called Motivation, that looked at, and it's the only book I've seen that actually has done real world experiments around the difference between compensation and other forms of reward and their impact. And it turns out the impact of a compliment versus money is freaking massive, like 4x over what it is. And so when you think about designing your reward systems, again, because comp is such a huge part of how we've thought about rewards previously, we tend to define through like the systems and experiences that we know. And by no means is probably Aurelia the only person. I haven't seen other real world experiences. And so if other people have seen other cool books, please let me know. I'm a geek. I love to learn, and I would love to hear about them. But it's nice to now go into quantifiable data with folks and say, hey, look, when we're thinking about designing our kind of overall compensation strategy, are we really doing differentiated individual levels of bonus? Or how are we thinking about taking some of that money and investing in leadership development or investing in these other places versus trying to do the kind of year-end exercise that is super painful, is definitely not fair. Back to our friend Marcus Buckingham, 60% of how I rate you is actually me, not you. And that is a provable fact. Like over a 500,000 person experiment across multiple industries. And we know it from our school days. There were teachers that were Halo graders, and there were teachers who were like, nobody was going to get an A in their class, right? And so, and yet we make all of our comp decisions based off of like what ultimately individual managers, their bosses, and other people, as though those decisions are not subjective. And the truth is they are. It's a difficult problem to solve. It's a really, really interesting one. But at any rate, when we think about incentives and rewards, non-monetary incentives, and then thinking about where we put some of our dollars that we've used to kind of invest, whether that's in culture, definition, amplification in our recruitment efforts, or whether that's in leadership development, I think those are really interesting places.
And I think there's a whole subject to delve into there on leadership development. And what does it really mean? Because, I mean, again, this is the definition of fast, right? We can say fast is not slow, but not what speed it is. So I think, looking at all of these things, what is evident is that there is huge variability in culture as we go across different organizations. There are some key topics which are coming up here, which is communication, engagement, and then actually looking at being supportive in whether that's in the behaviors that you're trying to model, as well as the behaviors that you're trying to reward as well. I think looking at the challenge of this, it's not an easy solve. But what I think would be really interesting is to have people come back and speak about some of these things in a bit more detail. I knew it was going to be a challenge today to get across 4 major pillars of culture with 4 points each. As I said, I think we could probably spend an hour speaking about all of them. And what I think would be fantastic is from our audience is if they can provide further questions or specifics that they want to delve into, and maybe for us to be able to address those at a future time. But for today, I really do want to say thank you so much to everyone, because what we have shone a light on here is a very difficult subject. Unsurprisingly, we haven't quite cracked the code. I feel like this is the Human Genome Project. It's going to take a while. But what I think we have done is hopefully made people think. And what I would say is that if any of you guys do have resources that you want to share in addition to this, I will check in with KG as well. I hope she's okay. And then we will actually kind of disseminate this across both the audience members as well as you guys as well. So from my side, a huge thank you for joining us. And I hope that you'll come back.
Yeah, I mean, I think the suggestion around case studies, to the degree that we can present, sort of what we're doing in different areas, I think would be cool. I'd be interested in hearing about some of the things that were mentioned for some of my colleagues. And then I'm also happy to, if there are questions that were in the chat we didn't get a chance to answer, if you guys want to send those out, Alex, and we can kind of do quick responses, as long as it's not 1,000 of them, which I doubt it will be. I'm happy to fire off, and would love to hear what my colleagues have to say too as well. So thank you.
It was fun. Thank you. It was a great meeting everybody. I hope this was insightful. I certainly learned some things. Brad has a vast library that I'm just going to ask him to send us pictures of all his books. But it was great. I appreciate the conversation and the banter, and it was actually fun as well. So thank you.
Yeah, I agree, guys. This was great. I think it's fair to say we all want to have that magnet to, as our culture. So it's good to get some additional insights on that. So thanks. Happy to be part of this.
Fantastic. Well, I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the week. I know that we're probably all up against it, as we always are, and really look forward to catching up with everyone at a later date. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.